The scream that cut through the desert air that evening would haunt me forever. But what I found tied to those railroad tracks was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. I was riding back to town, after checking the cattle on the north pasture, when the sun started bleeding orange across the sky. My horse Thunder had been restless all afternoon, and I figured a storm was coming. The railroad tracks stretched like a metal scar across the desert floor, and that's when I heard it again. Not a scream this time, but a desperate sobbing that made my blood run cold. There she was, a young woman, maybe 25, bound tight to the railroad ties with thick rope. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt, her blue dress torn at the sleeves. She was pulling against the ropes so hard that her wrists were bleeding, but whoever had tied her knew their knots. These weren't the work of some drifter. They were precise, methodical, like someone who'd done this before. I jumped down from Thunder and ran toward her, my boots crunching on the gravel between the ties. Her eyes went wide when she saw me, and she tried to speak through the gag in her mouth. I could see the terror in her face, but there was something else too. Recognition, like she knew exactly who had done this to her. The rope was thick as my thumb and wound around her so many times I couldn't see where it started or ended. I pulled out my knife and started sawing at the first strand, but the blade was dull from skinning rabbits that morning. Each cut took forever, and I could feel precious seconds slipping away like sand through my fingers. That's when I heard it, the distant whistle of the evening freight train. It always came through at sunset, carrying supplies to the mining towns up north. I knew that whistle like my own heartbeat, and I knew exactly how much time we had. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. I worked faster, the sweat dripping into my eyes as I sawed through rope after rope. The woman was trying to tell me something through her gag, her eyes darting frantically toward the horizon. When I finally pulled the cloth from her mouth, her first words weren't what I expected. She gasped for air and whispered, "They're coming back. You have to leave me and run." But I couldn't run. Not when I could hear that train whistle getting closer, and not when I saw the fear in her eyes that told me this was just the beginning of something much darker than I could have imagined. I ignored her warning and kept cutting at the ropes, but they seemed endless. For every strand I freed, there were 3 more underneath. Whoever had tied her wanted to make sure she wasn't going anywhere, and they'd done their job well. My hands were starting to shake, not from fear, but from the realization that this wasn't some random act of violence. The woman's name was Sarah, she told me between gasps of air. She worked at the general store in town, and she'd been walking home from visiting her sick mother when they grabbed her. But when I asked who they were, her face went white as fresh snow. She looked toward the distant hills and whispered, "The Garrett brothers. They said they were going to send a message that would be heard all the way to the state capitol." I knew the Garrett brothers by reputation, 3 men who'd been causing trouble in our county for months. They robbed stagecoaches, rustled cattle, and had killed at least 2 lawmen that I knew of. But tying an innocent woman to railroad tracks was a new low, even for them. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. I could feel the vibration in the rails under my knees, that subtle humming that meant death was coming fast down those metal tracks. My knife finally broke through another section of rope, freeing her right arm, but her legs were still bound tight to the rails. That's when I saw them. 3 riders on the ridge about a quarter-mile away, sitting motionless on their horses like vultures waiting for a meal. Even from that distance, I could see they were watching us, probably enjoying the show. They wanted me to see them. They wanted me to know that this was planned, calculated, and that I was walking into their trap. Sarah saw them too, and she started struggling against the remaining ropes with renewed panic. "They told me someone would come," she said, her voice breaking. "They said they wanted to see what kind of man would try to be a hero." The vibration in the tracks was getting stronger now. I could hear the distant chug of the engine, the screech of metal wheels on metal rails. We had maybe 5 minutes before that train came around the bend, and I was starting to understand that the Garrett brothers had planned this whole thing like a deadly game. But what they didn't know was that I'd been hunting dangerous men my whole life, and I wasn't about to let some cowards hiding on a ridge decide who lived and who died in my county. The question was whether I could free Sarah and face 3 armed killers before that train turned us both into nothing more than a memory. My knife snapped clean in half just as I freed Sarah's left leg. The blade had been through too much, and the thick rope had finally won. I threw the useless handle aside and started clawing at the remaining ropes with my bare hands, my fingernails splitting and bleeding as I worked. The train whistle sounded again, and this time I could hear the engine's deep rumble echoing off the canyon walls. The rails were vibrating constantly now, sending tremors up through my knees. We had maybe 3 minutes before that locomotive came roaring around the bend, and Sarah's right leg was still bound tight to the iron rail. I looked up toward the ridge, and the 3 riders were moving now, picking their way down the slope toward us. They weren't in any hurry. They knew they had us exactly where they wanted us. Sarah followed my gaze and let out a sob that cut through me like a knife. "I have to tell you something," she said, grabbing my arm with her free hand. "This isn't just about me. They said they were going to kill anyone who tried to help. And then they were going to burn down the church where my father preaches. They said they wanted to show the whole county what happens when people stand up to them." My blood ran cold. Reverend Marcus was Sarah's father, and he'd been the one leading the fight to bring law and order to our territory. He'd written letters to the territorial governor, organized town meetings, and even testified against the Garrett brothers when they'd been arrested last spring. The judge had let them go on a technicality, but Marcus had made them look like fools in front of the whole county. This wasn't about robbery or revenge, this was about terror. They wanted to break the spirit of every decent person in 100 miles, and they were starting with the preacher's daughter. I wrapped my hands around the rope, binding her right leg, and pulled with everything I had. The hemp cut into my palms like wire, and I felt something warm running down my wrists. Flood, but I didn't care. The sound of the approaching train was getting louder, and I could see a faint light in the distance that meant we were almost out of time. Sarah was crying now, not from pain, but from the horrible understanding of what was about to happen. "Leave me," she whispered. "Save yourself and warn my father. Don't let them win." But I couldn't leave her. Not when I could see the terror in her eyes, and not when I knew that running away would haunt me for the rest of my life. The rope around her leg was loosening, but not fast enough. The train's headlight was visible now, a single eye of light cutting through the desert twilight. That's when I heard the hoofbeats behind us, and a voice that made my skin crawl called out across the desert air. Well, well, looks like we caught ourselves a real hero." I turned around slowly, keeping my hands visible. The 3 Garrett brothers sat on their horses about 30 yards away, spread out in a line like they were posing for a photograph. Marcus Garrett, the oldest, was a big man with a black beard and cold eyes that had seen too much killing. His brothers, Tom and Billy, flanked him on either side, their hands resting easy on their gun belts. "You boys picked the wrong woman to mess with," I said, standing up slowly. The train was close enough now that I could feel the ground shaking under my boots. Maybe 2 minutes, probably less. Marcus laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Did we now? And who might you be to tell us our business?" "Name's Jake Thompson. I run cattle on the North Range, and I don't take kindly to men who tie women to railroad tracks." "Jake Thompson," Marcus repeated, like he was tasting the name. "I heard of you. They say you used to hunt bounty before you turned to ranching. They say you killed 8 men down in Arizona territory." It was 7, but I didn't correct him. That was a long time ago. "Not so long that you've forgotten how to die, I reckon." Marcus spit into the dust and shifted in his saddle. "Here's what's going to happen, Thompson. You're going to turn around and walk away from that woman. You're going to ride back to town and forget you ever saw anything out here. And if you're real smart, you'll pack up your cattle and move on to some other territory." The train whistle screamed again, so close now that it hurt my ears. Sarah was struggling with the last rope, her fingers bloody from trying to untie knots that wouldn't budge. The headlight was bright enough to cast shadows on the ground around us. "And if I don't?" I asked. Billy Garrett, the youngest, grinned and drew his pistol. "Then you'll die right here with the preacher's daughter, and we'll tell everyone in town that Jake Thompson tried to be a hero and ended up as buzzard food." I could see the calculation in Marcus's eyes. They'd planned this whole thing, but they hadn't expected someone like me to show up. They wanted to terrorize the county, but they couldn't afford to let a witness walk away. They were going to kill us both one way or another. The train's light was blinding now, and I could hear the squeal of brakes as the engineer spotted something on the tracks ahead. But it was too late to stop a fully loaded freight train, and we all knew it. I had maybe 30 seconds to make a choice that would decide whether Sarah lived or died. I drew my Colt and put 2 bullets into Billy Garrett before he could blink. The youngest brother tumbled backward off his horse, his unfired pistol hitting the ground with a metallic clang. But Tom was faster than I expected, and his shot caught me in the left shoulder, spinning me around and dropping me to one knee. The train was so close now that the ground was shaking like an earthquake. 20 seconds, maybe 15. Sarah screamed my name as blood soaked through my shirt, but I forced myself back to my feet. Marcus was taking careful aim at my head when I heard something that changed everything. More hoofbeats, coming fast from the east. Sheriff Wade burst over the ridge with 3 deputies, their horses lathered with sweat from a hard ride. Marcus cursed and swung his rifle toward the lawman, but he was caught between 2 fires now. Tom tried to reload, but Deputy Morrison put a bullet through his chest before he could chamber another round. "Thompson!" Sheriff Wade yelled over the roar of the approaching locomotive. "Get her off those tracks!" I stumbled back to Sarah, my left arm hanging useless at my side. The rope around her leg was loosened but not free, and my right hand was slick with blood. The train's headlight was blinding now, and I could see the engineer leaning out of the cab, frantically pulling on the brake wheel. But physics doesn't care about desperation. A loaded freight train needs half a mile to stop, and we didn't have half a mile. Sarah looked into my eyes and said the words that nearly broke me. "I can't feel my leg. I think it's caught under the rail somehow." I looked down and saw what she meant. In their rush to tie her up, the Garrett brothers had somehow wedged her foot under the heavy iron rail. Even if I cut the rope, she wasn't going anywhere. My blood ran cold as I realized what this meant. We needed tools, maybe even a crowbar, to free her leg from under that rail. 10 seconds. Sheriff Wade was still exchanging shots with Marcus Garrett, who had taken cover behind a boulder. The outlaw was trapped but not beaten, and I could see the wild desperation in his eyes. He'd rather die fighting than face a hangman's noose. "Jake," Sarah grabbed my hand with both of hers. "Listen to me. My father has a lockbox buried under the church. There's evidence about a land grab scheme that goes all the way to the territorial governor. The Garrett brothers were just hired guns. If I die, you have to make sure someone finds that evidence." The train whistle was one long, continuous scream now. The engineer had given up trying to stop and was just warning everyone to get clear. But I wasn't getting clear, and neither was Sarah. "You're not dying today," I told her, though I wasn't sure how I was going to keep that promise. That's when Marcus Garrett made his last desperate play, and everything went to hell in ways I never could have imagined. Marcus stepped out from behind the boulder with his hands up, like he was surrendering. Sheriff Wade held his fire, probably thinking the fight was over. But I'd seen that look in desperate men's eyes before, and I knew Marcus Garrett wasn't giving up. He was buying time for something worse. "I'll make you a deal, Sheriff," Marcus called out over the deafening roar of the approaching train. "Let me ride out of here and I'll tell you how to save the girl." 8 seconds, maybe 7. Wade actually hesitated, which was exactly what Marcus was counting on. The outlaw's hand moved toward something on his belt. Not a gun, but a small leather pouch. He pulled out what looked like a metal key and held it up where we could all see it. "This opens the special lock they put on that rope," he shouted. "Garrett family trade secret. You'll never cut through it without this key." I looked down at Sarah's leg and saw it for the first time. A small metal device integrated into the rope system, something I'd missed in the poor light and my desperation. It was like a puzzle lock, designed to make the rope impossible to cut or untie without the right tool. But I knew Marcus was lying about letting Sarah go. His eyes had that dead look of a man who'd already decided to take as many people with him as he could. This wasn't about escape. This was about making sure his enemies suffered before he died. 5 seconds. The train was right there, its massive iron bulk filling my vision. I could see individual bolts on the cowcatcher, could smell the coal smoke and hot metal. The engineer was hanging out of the cab, screaming something I couldn't hear over the mechanical thunder. Marcus threw the key high into the air, and it glinted once in the train's headlight before disappearing into the darkness somewhere behind us. Then he pulled a stick of dynamite from his belt, already lit and sparkling with a short fuse. "If I'm going to hell," he screamed, "I'm taking all of you with me." 3 seconds. Sheriff Wade shot Marcus through the heart, but dead men can still throw dynamite. The stick sailed through the air toward the railroad tracks, and I realized that even if the train didn't kill us, the explosion would finish the job. 2 seconds. I wrapped my good arm around Sarah and threw both of us as far from the tracks as my wounded body could manage. The world became a nightmare of sound and light. The train's whistle, the hiss of steam, the approaching thunder of iron wheels on iron rails. 1 second. The dynamite hit the ground right next to the tracks, just as the locomotive roared past the spot where Sarah had been tied. But instead of exploding, the stick just lay there, its fuse sputtering in the dirt. A dud. Marcus Garrett's final act of revenge had failed, just like everything else in his worthless life. But as I lay there in the dirt with Sarah in my arms, both of us shaking from shock and relief, I realized this nightmare was far from over. Because Sarah's words about corruption reaching all the way to the territorial governor meant that the Garrett brothers had just been the beginning of something much bigger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The train finally stopped about 200 yards down the track, its brakes screaming against the rails like a wounded animal. Steam hissed from the engine as the crew climbed down to see what had happened. Sheriff Wade and his deputies were already moving among the bodies, checking to make sure the Garrett brothers wouldn't be causing any more trouble. But my attention was focused on Sarah, who was trying to sit up despite her injured leg. The rope burns on her wrists were deep and I could see she was in shock, but she was alive. That was what mattered. The key, she whispered, looking around frantically. We have to find that key he threw. I knew it was hopeless. Marcus had thrown it into the darkness during the chaos, and finding a small metal object in acres of desert scrub would take days, if it was even possible. But Deputy Morrison had an idea that surprised all of us. Don't need a key, he said, kneeling down beside the rope mechanism. My daddy was a locksmith before he took to ranching. This here's just a fancy version of a puzzle lock. He pulled out a small tool from his vest pocket and started working on the device. Give me 5 minutes. While Morrison worked on freeing Sarah's leg, Sheriff Wade came over to check on my shoulder wound. The bullet had gone clean through, missing the bone, but I was losing more blood than I cared to think about. You're going to need a doctor, Wade said, pressing his bandana against the wound. But first, tell me about this evidence Sarah mentioned. Something about a land grab scheme? Sarah's eyes went wide with fear, not from pain but from the realization of what she'd revealed in her desperation. I shouldn't have said anything. If they find out that my father has been gathering evidence, they already tried to kill you once, I pointed out. Staying quiet isn't going to keep you safe now. Over the next hour, as the train crew helped clear the scene and the doctor from town tended to our wounds, Sarah told us a story that made my blood run cold. Her father, Reverend Marcus, had been documenting a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Officials were taking bribes to approve fraudulent land claims, allowing wealthy investors to steal homesteads from settlers who couldn't afford lawyers. The Garrett brothers had been hired to intimidate anyone who tried to fight back. They'd burned out 3 families, killed a surveyor who'd refused to falsify documents, and now they'd tried to murder the daughter of the man leading the resistance. The evidence is buried in a lockbox under the church altar, Sarah said. Names, dates, bank records, everything. But if something happens to my father, nothing's going to happen to your father, Sheriff Wade promised. But we're going to need that evidence if we want to clean up this mess. 6 months later, I was sitting in a courtroom in the territorial capital, my left arm still weak from the bullet wound but functional. 12 men had been convicted of conspiracy and fraud, including a territorial judge and 2 high-ranking officials. The Garrett brothers were dead, but their employer was facing 20 years in prison. Sarah sat beside me, her hand resting on mine. The rope scars on her wrists had faded to thin white lines, but I knew the memories would take longer to heal. We'd been through hell together, and somehow that had forged something stronger than either of us had expected. But the cost had been real. Reverend Marcus had suffered a heart attack from the stress of the investigation and trial. He'd recovered, but he was a frailer man now, aged years in a matter of months. 3 families had lost their homes before we'd been able to stop the land grab scheme, and I'd learned that there were kinds of evil in the world that went deeper than anything I'd faced as a bounty hunter. As we walked out of that courthouse, Sarah squeezed my hand and said, "Do you think it was worth it?" I thought about that train whistle cutting through the desert air, about the terror in her eyes when I'd found her tied to those tracks, about the choice I'd made to fight instead of run. "Ask me in 50 years, I said, and we headed home to build something good on land that honest people had died to protect.